Good evening. Whoa. Welcome to the annual Swanberg Lecture in Military History. First of all, I'd like to thank Arnold Swanberg, whose generosity makes this series possible. We in the History Department may not, like Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire, depend on the kindness of strangers, but we do depend more than ever on the generosity of friends and alums. Also, I think it's important to thank the Denison Theater for providing this venue at a discounted rate, and thank MCAT for a grant to record this lecture. Finally, one more thank you to my colleague and friend Linda Fry, who can't be here tonight, but without whose work tonight's event would never have happened. This evening, our speaker is a distinguished military historian, Robert Citino, who's currently Samuel Zemurray Stone Senior Historian at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Setting aside our speaker's accomplishments as a scholar and his fame for his numerous appearances on the History Channel, Professor Citino's an especially appropriate speaker, I think, for us here tonight. Believe it or not, UM has a long association with the World War II Museum in New Orleans. Steve Ambrose, one of the founders of the World War II Museum, had a home in Helena, was a longtime friend of the History Department, and maybe most important of all, was a donor to the History Department. Two of his children, Stephanie and Hugh, earned degrees in history at the University of Montana, and Hugh did his BA and MA at UM. It was, I think, maybe my favorite graduate student. He wrote a thesis on Truman and McCarthy. He went on to become a best-selling historian and author, and he served as the vice president of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. So even though Professor Citino is new to Missoula, this is his first trip, we feel as though he is part of our family. Robert Michael Citino was born in Cleveland, did his BA at Ohio State, his MA and PhD at Indiana University, and he's taught at the University of North Texas, Eastern Michigan University, and Lake Erie College. But beyond that, he's taught at West Point, and he's also taught at the Army War College, which is a distinct honor. That is the fast-track officers who are on their way to their first star. It's the Army's advanced graduate school, and those are very, very sharp people. Professor Citino's work has earned numerous prizes, including the American Historical Association's Paul Birdsall Prize for the best book in European military and strategic history. He's the author of 10 books that include The Wehrmacht's Last Stand, German Campaigns of 1944 to 1945, The Wehrmacht Retreats, Fighting a Lost War, 1943, The Death of the Wehrmacht, The German Campaigns of 1942, and also a related study, The German Way of War, from the 30 Years' War to the Third Reich. Professor Citino has made the intriguing argument that first Prussian and then German military planners concluded that given Germany's geographical position and its limited base of resources, any war they fought needed to be short and decisive. The German army therefore emphasized operational factors, often at the expense of larger strategic concerns. Professor Citino has argued that this led to a conceptual box from which German military leaders could not escape. It's worth considering. Tonight, Professor Citino's talk is titled The Big Collapse, the German Military in 1945. Please give a warm welcome, first time in Missoula, to Professor Robert Citino.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction, but above all, the shout out to Blanche Dubois. Coming in from New Orleans, I really do feel like I'm at home right now. I have a family tie here to the west, at least, if not to Montana. My sister and brother-in-law live in Powell, Wyoming, which is about an hour from the east gate of Yellowstone National Park. And I'm a Cleveland kid, and now I live in New Orleans, literally in a 5-block area. I don't own a car. I walk to work. And so I'm always impressed by the distances, the vast distances of life in the West. And when we first visited my sister, Pam, who lives in Powell, Wyoming, we're there for the week. We're there on a weekend. She said, I'm going to take you to Red Lodge for breakfast. I thought Red Lodge was a restaurant in Powell, Wyoming. And we went out on the road, and it was there was hours. It seemed like hours. And I learned that Red Lodge was actually in another state altogether. I've never forgotten that moment. It's really wonderful to be here. I walked around your fair city a good deal today, and it is a lovely, lovely place indeed. The air smells clean and sweet and very, very different from New Orleans, which is a different kind of lovely, lovely city. So I've been asked to talk today about the big collapse, the German military in 1945. And I'm going to do that, but I am going, as you'll see, to focus on one arm of that military, which I think was decisive in the big collapse that the Germans went through in that year. So by the beginning of 1945, it was all falling apart. The German military, the Wehrmacht, I'll use the term tonight, it means armed forces, was on the run all over the map. And so this map was turning into this map. The Red Army in the east was slicing through one German defensive position after the other, heading from the Vistula River to the Oder, and then with the ultimate destination, of course, of Berlin. In the west, the Allies were crashing over the Rhine River, encircling a gigantic German force in the Ruhr region, and driving into the heart of industrial Germany. By now, I presume many of you know the story, with the end near, Germany relying on hasty drafts of old men and boys. Things could not have looked worse. You know, I've spent a lifetime in German military history, and the Germans are reputed to have a special genius for war. It's the name of a book about the German army when I was a very young graduate student by a colonel in the U.S. Army, as a matter of fact. But if they were geniuses for war, you sure wouldn't have been able to tell if you were paying close attention in early 1945. It looked like they could not have been worse at it, like perhaps they chose the worst possible occupation. Another book about the German army, written again in the long ago period, was The Devil's Virtuosos. And right now they're playing out of tune and out of time, and they just could not have looked worse at what they were trying to do. So the question is, you know, how do you go from that all-conquering force at the beginning of the war to this disastrous situation by the end of it? So I've written, as I heard, 10 books, and in some way, it's in the beginning or the opening or after the colon in the title, the word blitzkrieg appears. I could write anything, and my publisher will put blitzkrieg in the title. I could write a book, I could write a cookbook, great recipes of blitzkrieg, love sonnets of blitzkrieg. I kid about what I'm going to be doing next. But blitzkrieg, the Germans pioneered a kind of new style of war early in the conflict that still defines a great deal about how modern military operations are planned, led, and conducted. So how do you go from blitzkrieg to the big collapse? Now, one key, and I would argue perhaps the key to this incredible panorama of defeat, from that to that, was the almost complete disappearance in the latter stages of the war of the German Luftwaffe. By 1944, and especially 45, the German military had essentially been stripped of air cover, and it was being hounded by massive Allied air forces prowling the skies over it. German ground units were reduced to moving by night. And we always say this when the Allies were landing in D-Day. By this time, the German military could not move by day. We always say this as if it's the most natural thing in the world. But I would submit to you, if you cannot move by day, military operations are going to become increasingly difficult. Even at night, you had to be very, very careful, because the Allies by now had night fighters that could prowl around you and pounce upon you as well. But German units were reduced to moving by night. Launching an assault, which has to take place during the day, was often a hopeless exercise. Allied aircraft would be on German ground forces in an instant, strafing, bombing, firing rockets. So read any account by a German foot soldier. The Germans use this very nice term, Lanzer. It means kind of what we say in America, ground pounder, if you're talking about an infantryman, an ordinary grunt. Read any memoir by a German grunt or a Lanzer in the wars last year, and they read as if they were written by the same person. They all say the same thing in virtually the same language. Their greatest fear, being caught out in the open by an Allied fighter bomber. So that would mean something like this. The P-47 Thunderbolt. It carries heavy machine guns, bombs, a full panoply of rockets. Every kind of high explosive that was in the American arsenal at the time was being carried by a P-47 Thunderbolt. Fighter bomber. It could duel with German planes in the air on more than equal terms, but it could also destroy German ground forces. So in German, Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. Abbreviated as Jabo. So you read a German account of last year of the war, and you will read of fear of the Jabo. In fact, German grunts even invented a new word, and it was Jabotod. It meant to be killed by an Allied fighter bomber, Jabo death, which meant being caught out in the open by a P-47 or one of the other Allied aircraft and obliterated. It's not usually a small caliber round, and it's usually a very grisly death. Most famous victim of a Jabo was probably Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was caught out in the open on a narrow French country lane, he and his driver in his staff car, attacked probably by a Hawker Hurricane or Typhoon, one of the Commonwealth fighter bombers. The driver killed, the car careens out of control, Rommel thrown from the car, so badly injured the first responders thought he was dead. He managed to survive. So think for a moment of this statistic. I don't like to play, not really a statistical kind of person, and I think they can be used in various ways. But here's a statistic that I think does not lie. On D-Day, for the big landing on June 6, 1944. I work for a museum today that is the National World War II Museum, but it started with a smaller purview, and it was to be the D-Day Museum, just to look at that heroic day of June 6, 1944. On D-Day, the Allies put 8,268 operational aircraft in the air. They probably flew 20,000 sorties. So, each plane flies more than one mission, and so you wind up with how many missions you've flown. But let's just look at the number of aircraft, 8,268. The Germans, did their best and put precisely, we know the exact number, you can count them, 160 aircraft into the air on June 6, 1944. Now, that tells a great deal of the story of what happened on D-Day. Look, if you were a part of the 1st Infantry Division landing on the dog green sector of Omaha and you were being shot to pieces, you probably didn't care what the total number of aircraft, both sides. You were in a tight spot. But seen as a whole, over the 150-mile stretch of beach, German aircraft was virtually absent. German air power was virtually absent. And I would say that set a perfect tone for the rest of the war going forward. So it didn't matter how aggressive German commanders were, how well-drilled German infantry was. It didn't matter what a fearsome weapon the MG-42, the famous German machine gun, Hitler's bone saw, as the Germans actually called it, chattering away. It barely mattered. The Allies had pretty decent troops and good training and decent commanders by this time too, and they also had an air force overhead. So I would, when we talk about the German collapse, and again, this is, I would like to say I came up with this. Germans themselves who came up with it. German commanders and soldiers writing their memoirs. The big story, I think, was the almost complete absence of a German air force in this latter period of the war. And so what I would like to do today is talk about that process. Talk about how the Germans go from, from dominance in the early point of the war to downfall, to almost complete downfall, and then to ultimate extinction. So in talking about why the Germans lacked an air force in 1944, you have to ask what had happened here. If there was one area in which the Germans had a clear superiority, over their adversaries when the war broke out in 1939, it was in the air. We talk about German tanks, the feared Panzers. The principal German tank in 1939 was a two-man crew weapon. It was a kind of a tankette. It didn't have a main gun in the turret. It had a couple of machine guns. It was hardly the fearsome Tiger tank of the latter period of the war. So if you're looking for German strength in the early period, we often look at the tanks, but I'm not sure that's the right thing to do at all. I think we need to look up. We need to look in the air. So Hitler came to power presumably many of you know this date, 1933. It's one I feel like I was born in 1933. I'll lecture on this so much. And immediately plunged Germany into a headlong rearmament program. He was very skilled at telling neighboring states that he wished nothing more than peaceful development in Europe. And he could do it pretty convincingly. He'd been a soldier in World War I. He'd been gassed at the front. He'd been decorated. You know, he won the Iron Cross and then had oak leaf clusters put on it. He could make that claim. I've seen war. I don't want war. But his actions said otherwise. He immediately began a rapid, I would say headlong, rearmament program. Share of national output, national economic output, going to the military, rose from about 1% when Hitler came in January 1933 to 20% in just 6 years by 1939. I don't know. I don't track this sort of thing, but this seems to me the all-time record. I'm not sure anyone's increased defense spending in the course of 6 years nearly 20 times over as Hitler did. Now, even though over time, lack of raw materials, thinking here of bauxite, which is used to make aluminum, and then iron ore, of course, for steel. Lack of raw materials was starting to bite by the late 1930s. Nevertheless, Hitler's head start had given Germany a real strategic advantage, and the realization that he had the upper hand for the moment, but that the other powers, France, Great Britain, were stirring and might soon catch Germany, was one reason, big reason, that Hitler decided to go to war in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, which brings the other great powers in, and we soon have a war now called the Second World War. That immediately, of course, renames the previous war, which had been the Great War to everyone who fought it, but now needs a new name and goes down into the books as World War I. So, as a result of that spending spree, the Luftwaffe of 1939-1940 was the best in the world. The best Air Force in the world. The best planes flown by the most experienced and best trained pilots. So aircraft like the Messerschmitt, the Bf-109, this is a little later E variant of the plane, but the Messerschmitt Bf-109. Often we say Me-109, that's technically correct. It's a Bavarian factory, was essentially Fabrik, which is essentially what the BF stands for. But the Bf-109 fighter, the Stuka, the Ju-87 dive bomber. When I was teaching undergraduates, at some point your undergraduates think you're making words up. You know, when you say Sturzkampfflugzeug, they're always glad that there's abbreviation of Stuka. But this plane was probably the most feared plane in the world in 1939. A dive bomber, a nearly vertical dive, a sudden pull-up, and dropping a single bomb then with pinpoint accuracy. It was also equipped with an unusual ancillary device, which was a siren. So you would hear it before you saw it, and then it's sort of a louder and louder scream over your head, and you'd look up almost too late as it had dropped its bomb. Was it the best plane in the world? Hardly, but it was better dive bomber than any other country in the world was deploying at the time. There's the Messerschmitt Bf-110, a fighter bomber, again, supposedly able to dual aircraft, that is fighter to fighter, but also able to land ordnance on ground forces. It was known as a Zerstörer auf Deutsch, a destroyer aircraft. The Heinkel HE-111 medium bomber. These were all revolutionary designs for their day. The 109, I hate to do too much, I know it gets dizzying. The 109, in fact, is still down in the record books as the first, I try to get this straight, production model stressed skin low wing monoplane. All other, there were still biplanes in the sky at the time, that is 2 wings, and many of the monoplanes had the high wing, sort of that World War I style monoplane. This is the low wing monoplane. It revolutionized single seat fighters at the time. So the Germans came in, and in 1939 and 1940, these aircraft ruled the skies. The Germans beat Poland, destroyed the entire Polish army in the course of a couple of weeks. Another week was necessary to reduce the capital. There was a campaign in the north, in Denmark and Scandinavia. Denmark fell in 4 hours to German paratroopers and ground forces. Norway, a bigger country, 800 miles of coastline, a little bit longer, but once again, roughly a month. That was April of 1940. May of 1940 saw the Germans invade France on the Low Countries, and that was the greatest military campaign of all time up to that point, in which the Germans dismissed essentially a 2 million man Allied force and took 1.5 million prisoners in just a few weeks of fighting. The French were completely crushed. The British managed to escape by the skin of their teeth from the single port still in their possession. Of course, that was Dunkirk. I hope many of you have seen the film. I thought it was a good film. So these aircraft ruled the skies. Now, the only problem is that initial advantage, that initial German edge, soon vanished. It turns out that the other powers had advantages too, and you know, this sometimes seems counterintuitive, but it's not. It makes complete logic and sense. There's advantages that come from doing something second instead of blazing the trail. So if the Germans had built a stressed skin, low-wing monoplane, it was obviously possible to do so. And the other powers were able to follow suit. And so the RAF, for example, the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force in the Second World War, was outclassed certainly at the very beginning of the war in 1939. But as 1939 ended and 1940 dawned, so just a few months later, the war began in September, this aircraft was coming into service with the British. It's the famous Hawker Hurricane, Hawker being the aircraft production company. It was a match for the Bf-109. And so the German pilots over Britain suddenly found themselves in that Battle of Britain to be in very serious trouble when facing the Hawker Hurricane. That was soon followed by the deployment of this aircraft, the Supermarine Spitfire. I talk about the Germans all the time. I wanted to call it the Spitfire, but it's actually English pronunciation of Spitfire. This plane was more than a match for the 109. It could fly rings around a 109. And in fact, German pilots over Britain in the Battle of Britain would tell you just that. The Spitfire is the plane that glides in it seems like the last 30 minutes of the film Dunkirk. Flown by Tom Hardy, and it's how long can a plane stay in the air? Christopher Nolan, who directed that film, you may know, kind of played with the timeline. It speeds up and it slows down. I got my wife to attend Dunkirk with me by telling her Tom Hardy was in the film. And as you may know, you see 10 seconds of him at the very end of the film, and she still hasn't forgiven me for that. It's kind of tender, kind of raw. These are the aircraft then that in the summer of 1940, the Hurricane and the Spitfire, these are the aircraft that fought the Luftwaffe to a standstill in the skies over Great Britain. The British also came up with an extremely important defensive piece of technology that you probably have heard of before, radio detection and ranging, or radar, which allowed them to vector their aircraft very effectively against German attackers. So it was an advantage, and like all advantages in war, they're wasting advantages. You have them 1 week, and you probably have less than an advantage the next week, and then less still by the next month, and so on and so forth. And the Germans certainly experienced that in the opening year of, I believe, in less than a year of World War II. And so this strikes me now as the key moment. When the Luftwaffe stumbled with its next generation of aircraft, Germany's lead vanished altogether. And so I could go through a dozen of them, but without trying anyone's patience, let's look at two. Let's look at the misfire known as the Heinkel 177 bomber, and then the Me-210 fighter bomber. Here's where Germany's lead vanished altogether. The problem here was reliance on a very small number of designers. If Willy Messerschmitt, the owner of the Messerschmitt Corporation, the lead designer and then later the owner of his own corporation, if Willy Messerschmitt or Ernst Heinkel didn't design the plane, they probably didn't go into production in Germany in this period of the war. Their reputation, these two individuals, stood so high as designers, and they had proven it earlier, that the Luftwaffe often ordered their models into production without sufficient testing. So, it's a Messerschmitt. It's like saying it's a Ford. It's the Edsel. But it's a Ford. Ford had a wonderful reputation for automotive design at the time. The Edsel would hurt that, and so would these aircraft for these designers. So the Heinkel 177, without getting into too many details, it's a high-performance bomber, so it was advertised. It had a very complex, never-before-tried power plant. 2 twinned engines with each twin, so it's actually 4 engines in 2 columns, with each engine driving an oversized, extra-long 4-blade propeller. It's going to be the fastest bomber in the world at the time, so it said on its blueprints. It was rushed into production when these new British aircraft came online. Supposedly this could outrun a Spitfire. That's how it was advertised. It was rushed into production, despite having a tendency to blow up in midair. Mid-air level flight, which is, when you think about it, is what the airplane should be able to handle. We all know that a test pilot takes it up there and extends the envelope, right, higher and faster and does dangerous maneuvers. But this plane had a tendency to blow up simply, flying from point A to point B. The Luftwaffenfeuerzeug, the Luftwaffe's lighter, some of its pilots began to call it. No one has gallows humor like aircraft pilots. It's part of the job. The crash, as everyone knows, it's lurking out there, and someday it might get me too. And so there's this gallows humor, which I found pilots, not just German pilots, but pilots of all the nationalities in World War II and up to the present day share. So it was rushed into production. It blew up. It was rushed out of production in favor of the older bomber, the Heinkel HE-111. The Germans they missed a complete generation of aircraft transformation. So the Luftwaffe also put this plane into rapid production before thorough testing. Why? It was a Messerschmitt. He was the most famous aircraft designer in Germany. He has Adolf Hitler's ear. Hitler fancied himself a genius. So Hitler liked to talk to other men who fancied themselves geniuses, rather than the sort of slow, designed by committee that virtually all modern military equipment requires. Hitler liked the designer to come in, give him a blueprint, say this is going to be it, and then rush the aircraft into production. So it was rushed into a production based on confidence in Messerschmitt. It was unstable in level flight. Once again, the simplest play in the playbook is to fly straight and true, and it tended to lurch into a spin at high angles of attack. So if you turn this plane too quickly, you were almost certainly going to spin it out of the sky. So it too was yanked out of production, this time with no real backstop or replacement. Now, I want to balance this talk. I'm making the Germans sound like they don't know how to produce sophisticated aircraft. And that's wrong. German designers, and this to me is the great paradox of this whole story, yielded to no one in terms of expertise or innovation. In the course of World War II, they designed a fantastic series of aircraft. The first operational jet aircraft, the Messerschmitt 262, ME-262, which you can see at the Smithsonian Institution. There's one. There's several others in the world. There's also a song by the 1970s rock band Blue Oyster Cult named after the ME-262. The first operational jet aircraft. The first operational rocket aircraft, the Messerschmitt, there is his name again, the ME-163. This was like flying a Roman candle. It took off a skid, and then you had one pass at an Allied aircraft so fast you might not even be able to draw a bead on it for firing and then landing it. You can see it looks like a Roman candle, kind of like a ketchup bottle with wings. But this was the first operational rocket aircraft. The first, well, I wouldn't say the prototype of what we would call today the cruise missile. The V-1 buzz bomb, as the Allies called it, at least. The prototype of the intercontinental ballistic missile, the V-2. Hitler called these V weapons, Vergeltungswaffen, revenge weapons, vengeance weapons for the Allied bombing of Germany. Now, Hitler would have, the Germans would have these aircraft which would turn the tide on the Allies. They built and designed and built every manner of aircraft. Here's the Dornier DO-335 Aero. It's if you remember Dr. Dolittle, the push me, pull you. There's a kind of animal that walks in both directions at once. This has a pusher propeller in the back and a puller propeller in the front. Careful synchronization is required. Their torque cancels each other out, so the plane flies straight and true. A fantastic but very complex design. They made a jet aircraft from wood late in the war when aluminum and steel was lacking. And this is the famous Heinkel 162 People's Fighter, the Volksjäger. Imperial War Museum in London. You can see a Volksjäger. As far as I know, the only one in the world. I may be wrong about that. Their drawing boards in 1945 had some of the wildest designs you can possibly imagine. The four-engine ME-264. Please note the name of the bomber, the America bomber, sometimes known as the New York bomber, and that was to be its mission. Have transatlantic range and launch bombing raids on the American heartland. A prototype flew, but it never went into production. So we say it remained on the drawing board, but a little bit beyond that. They designed, and there's the Focke-Wulf TA-400, and an even bigger aircraft with 6 engines that once again would have transatlantic capability. The HO-18, the Horton brothers were designers. They built this. Would have been the first flying wing of the HO-18 if it ever actually went into production. You see here, we seem to be leaving World War II and entering the realm of science fiction, or perhaps entering the realm of the man in the high castle, which is the Amazon show in which the Axis has won the war, and the Germans are now flying rockets and jetcraft all over the world. It would have been the first flying wing, a plane designed by the U.S. Air Force finally in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Perhaps most amazing in this whole panoply of innovation was this aircraft, the Silverbird, known as the atmosphere skipper. This one requires a bit of explanation. Eugen Zenger was the great designer, kind of lone wolf, kind of quirky, half Edison and half mad scientist at the same time. So able to design, but some very advanced designs, but very difficult to produce. Weighed 100 tons. It was going to be a winged rocket launched from a 2-mile-long sled track. It would shoot up to 130,000 feet, slightly above the 25-mile level of denser atmosphere. Then dive down into the thicker air and bounce off it into another long, steep climb. The process would go on repeatedly until reaching an altitude of 175 miles, hence the term atmosphere skipper. And once again, theoretically, able to get across the Atlantic, able to cross the entire continental United States and get across the Pacific. Theoretically, there was no limit to how far the atmosphere skipper could fly. So we could go on and on here. They developed an incredible list. Delta wing aircraft of the sort that all air forces would be experimenting with in the 1950s and 60s. Drone carriers, some big motherships that would release hordes of drones. We even talk about that today. The military is very concerned about drone swarming. Ramjets, the Super Lorraine, Focke-Wulf Lorraine ramjet. It's an astonishing body of theoretical and design work. And by a certain point in the war, it didn't really matter. I can look at this stuff all day. I love looking at experimental aircraft of the late World War II period. But I also have to admit, as a historian, none of it really mattered. Let me explain why. By 1942, certainly at the end of 1941, Pearl Harbor, America in the war, Hitler joins the Japanese war on America. Germany was now at war with the world's 3 greatest industrial economies, which could employ advantages of mass production, economies of scale in a way that Germany could only dream of. This was now a war of attrition. And Germany's only option, given that it was a war of attrition, was to mass produce whatever it had at the moment. And what did that mean? That meant sticking with the Bf-109, the very first airplane I showed you. A plane that had been state-of-the-art in 1936. Hey, when the Germans trotted it out during the Spanish Civil War, believe me, it was something. But was hardly that 7 or 8 years later, especially after the sort of acceleration of design work sponsored by World War II. In the G variant of the aircraft, which introduced in 1943, It was so sluggish. It had been weighed down with so much new equipment. It was so unforgiving that Allied pilots would usually try to provoke it into a low-altitude dogfight, where it really required some pilot skill, because there was a very good chance that the poorly trained German pilot would crash the plane. I mean, Allies were banking on it, in fact, and could bank on it. It was bankable by 1943 and 1944. But again, Germany had no real choice. So there's the Luftwaffe in 1936. Watch carefully, please. That's the Luftwaffe in 1939. And that's the Luftwaffe in 1942. And that is in 1943, and that is in 1945. Still churning out Bf-109s. But really, Germany had no real choice. By the way, there was one other, a very fine aircraft design that did go into production by the Focke-Wulf Company, but the FW-190, but it was a very difficult plane to produce and could never be mass-produced in the style of this aircraft. So the Germans have to mass-produce the Bf-109. They have no choice. They're in a war of attrition. And they don't have any new designs, and it's do or die, and so we'll produce what we can. Now, mass production was easier said than done. Germany is being bombed. German factories are being bombed into smithereens. They're having to go underground, and the Germans are actually putting their industrial facilities into caves so that they can continue to produce in the teeth of a nonstop Allied bombing campaign around the clock. So the British RAF at night, the Americans during the day. British RAF at night, the Americans during the day. So Germany could not fight a manpower-intensive war, especially against the Soviet Union, and also man the factories they needed to keep up with the Allies. And here's where the Nazi solution was typically brutal. We might even say typically Nazi. They mass-produced by exploiting slave labor, by prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates. They did it on an unimaginable scale, with men like this one, Otto Furchner, SS Kommandant, working them to death in vast underground chambers like the tunnel complex of Mittelbau-Dora near Nordhausen in central Germany. It looks like he's a cruel man, and he looks like he's out of central casting. The whole notion about a picture to give teaching telling 1,000 words is really, really perfect here. You know, the numbers, they're impressive enough, I guess. In 1944, the Germans did produce 34,000 combat aircraft of all types. That number was up from 13,000 just 2 years before. So essentially, the Germans tripled their aircraft output. Slave laborers tripled German aircraft output in 2 years. So that's an impressive number. But it's not impressive when you compare it to this. The Allies, Germans built 34,000. The Allies built 127,000 aircraft that same year. About 4 times the German total. The United States of America, our arsenal of democracy, built 71,000 aircraft all by itself, more than twice the German total all by ourselves. And that's pretty typical, the pretty typical number as we go forward. In 1940, when President Roosevelt was trying to gear up American war production, he set at the time what looked like an impossible figure, 50,000 planes a year. He was told by everyone in the U.S. Army Air Corps at the time, the U.S. Army Air Forces. There was no independent Air Force. It was part of the Army. He was told by his air chiefs, his air experts. He was told by industrial experts, that's impossible. But by 1944, the United States was not producing 50,000, but 71,000. So in the course of the war, the Americans produced hundreds of thousands of aircraft, and more than twice the German total all by ourselves. That's not even discussing quality, which I think I've probably belabored that point already. The Germans are producing a very, very old and outdated aircraft, while the Americans and the Allies are producing new generations. Faster, stronger, heavier payloads, everything you could want in an aircraft. American aircraft are flying on 100-octane aviation fuel, and the Germans do not have access to that either. So there's all sorts of problems up and down. And so this, to me, is the real image, the real face of the German Luftwaffe, and in some ways, the real face of the German military in 1944 and 1945. Not visionary aircraft of fighters, jet fighters, or sleek rockets. But human skeletons chained to their drill presses and lathes, banging out parts for one obsolete Bf-109 after the other. A plane that had become kind of a death trap to the half-trained pilots who were forced to fly it. You know, I've just written a book called Wehrmacht's Last Stand, which is the German armed forces in the last 2 years of the war. 44, the full year, and then the half year. The war ends in May in 1945. When I was writing it, every author wants a good story arc. And I had real trouble with that book because the Germans are getting beat badly on page 1. And then, you invest 3 weeks of your life, and on page 500, they're getting beat even worse. So, what is happening in the course of that book? So I had to break it up into these themes, and this to me is one of the big ones, and it's the complete disappearance, and in some sense the extinction of the German Air Force. Service in the Luftwaffe turned into a kind of a death sentence, and in fact, service in the entire military turned into kind of a death sentence for the Germans in the last 6 months of the war. I mean, what is there to say when so many of the leaders of the Air Force actually committed suicide in the course of the war? You might have a cultural problem within your company, depending upon the number of suicides in your company. So there's Ernst Udet. He was the procurement chief at the outset of the war. He killed himself in November of 1941. There was operations chief Hans Jaschanek. He's in the middle there, not in the white, that's Goering, but next to him on Goering's left, so center. He was the operations chief in August of 1943. Stalingrad broke Jaschanek. He promised Hitler he would be able to supply the German troops encircled in Stalingrad and was unable to. 14 of 98 generals in the Luftwaffe killed themselves in the last days of the war. These were men who could not envision living in a world without Adolf Hitler. Could not envision living in a world without the Third Reich. Even the high commander of the Air Force, the Oberkommando Luftwaffe, the OKL, Hermann Goering, and there he is, a nice semi-svelte picture of him from earlier in his career. He killed himself in October 1946, as you may know, while in Allied custody and about to be hanged for war crimes. But it's a big number. So what can we say? Well, there is one thing we can say. The demise of the Luftwaffe, as I've traced it for you right now, from dominance to downfall, we might call it, if alliteration is your thing, was just one of the many prices that the German military paid for its loyalty to Hitler, whose policies, whose thoughts literally of world conquest, which has a bad record in the history of mankind. There have been leaders from time to time who have talked of world conquest, and none have ever really achieved it. But his policies had led them all into an overstretched global war with utterly inadequate resources. And this, to me, is the key to understanding the Wehrmacht's performance in World War II's endgame. But I think it also teaches us a valuable lesson about war in general that stretches beyond World War II. It stretches to our present day. It stretches back to the beginning of humankind. Whatever Hitler and his commanders might have wished to do, they often had no real choice, and we've seen that with the continued reliance on the Messerschmitt 109. War forces you to do all sorts of things you hadn't planned to do. Things you didn't want to do, but things you have to do anyway. And that, to me, is yet another reason why we should always treat war as the ultima ratio, as the old Romans used to say, the last resort, rather than the first one. Thank you very much. I've been told I can hold this microphone, and happy to answer any questions anyone from the floor might have. It can be on the Luftwaffe. It can be almost on anything you like. I'm a World War II guy, so trust me. Why don't you start? Why don't you just ask a question? Because I can repeat it to everyone, but because it's tough for you to get out. I can see that.
I accept your Luftwaffe thesis.
Thank you.
But still, in the fall of 1943 and the spring of 1944, the first few months, you're doing very, very well against Allied bombers, almost flying them out of the sky.
Right.
They have a positive sum on the Eastern Front relative to Russian fighters. Isn't the decline of the Luftwaffe mainly after that?
Well, I mean, yes. Oh, let me repeat your question. So I got general agreement with the overall thesis about the Luftwaffe, but the question is, what about the early strategic bombing campaign? American bombers were being shot out of the sky. The Luftwaffe is doing pretty good against the Russians in the east. I mean, in terms of the overall kill ratio. You know, that's really true, and the strategic bombing campaign is a sort of a whole other story and a whole other talk, but I'll suffice it for me to say this about the Allied strategic bombing campaign. They were making it up from the beginning. They were bombing, early bombing raids were being done with hopelessly inadequate numbers of bombers. Remember, the U.S. Army Air Forces was claiming, U.S. Air Forces was, the U.S. Army Air Forces were claiming that they could bomb German cities without any fighter escort at all. They had a wonder weapon, the B-17 Flying Fortress, bristling with heavy machine guns all over it. And it was going to be able to defend itself. Now, like a lot of untested military hypotheses, that proved not to be true when it was actually put into play. So when the Americans finally, when the Allies, I won't say the Americans, when the Americans and British, the Allies, finally realized the depth of the problem, that they're not going to make any headway unless there's an escort, it's when kind of, design work kind of gets ratcheted up on the P-51 Mustang. Now, the P-51 Mustang was an American aircraft, kind of underperforming, had an American airframe with an Allison engine, kind of underperforming. The British took a look at it and said, Rolls-Royce Merlin engine would fit under that cowling. So, American airframe, British engine, becomes the great new wonder weapon on the Allied side. You put extra drop tanks on it. Those P-51s could escort American or Allied bombers into the heart of Germany, over Berlin itself, and still have enough fuel to dogfight over Berlin and drive a German fighter aircraft out of the skies. So I'll just say this. Yes, I accept your hypothesis that Germans were still doing pretty well up to a certain point in the war, but they had never come up really with a replacement aircraft. I mean, one of the reasons the P-51 could get over Berlin and then fly rings around a typical Bf-109. And, we always say the back of the German Luftwaffe was broken in a single month, January 1944, depending upon how you date it. Their raids in January and then early February 1944. And those big weeks are what really drive the Luftwaffe out of the sky, but a lot of that has to do with a superior second, maybe even third generation American aircraft appearing over Berlin and duking it out with a first generation, even pre-World War II German fighter. So I accept your point, but I also think there's something to what I'm saying about that particular encounter between the two air forces. By the way, no one's saying these weren't good pilots or brave pilots. I sense there's some air power knowledge in this room. Typical German fighter aircraft tactic was to play chicken, to fly head-on against the B-17. Two aircraft approaching one another at speed. Because that was really the vulnerable spot of the B-17. It's where you get the least machine gun fire directed forward. But it's a nerve-rattling exercise for everyone concerned. So there's a very fine book on the 8th Air Force, and I'd recommend it to anyone in the room, by Donald Miller. And I was just talking to someone in the audience about Holden, wherever Holden is. There you are, Holden. Hi. Called Masters of the Air. So that, to me, is the book. I recommend it to everyone. Really takes you through that whole thing. Sir.
Can you speak to the use of amphetamines with the German army?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I got that.
Amphetamines, speed.
Amphetamines. Hey, can I speak on amphetamines? Yes, I can. There's been a very good book recently written by a British journalist, a German journalist, Berlin, by the name of Norman Ohler, and he wrote a book called Blitzed. And it's a play on words. So it's about the widespread use of commercial amphetamines in the German army in World War II. And there was no doubt about it. And they were being doled out double doses to Luftwaffe pilots, particularly after sort of the huge losses of late 43, early 44, and German Luftwaffe pilots are younger and younger and have fewer and fewer hours in the cockpit. So the drug was called Pervitin, brand name. We would know it here in America as methamphetamine. Now, it's not crystal meth of the sort that someone cooks up in there, which is, can vary widely in dosages. It's why it kills people. It's carefully controlled, made in a laboratory, but it is a form of methamphetamine. There was also a heavy painkiller, which kind of dulled the senses, brand name Oikadal. We talked about the opioid crisis in America. The Germans were doling that stuff out to the military wholesale. Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about it. Virtually every army and every military force in World War II took some form of stimulant. And I mean beyond, let's say coffee is the sort of socially acceptable stimulant. But beyond coffee, I mean pharmaceuticals, virtually everyone was. But which country in the world had the most advanced pharmaceutical industry? By far the Germans. Check the Nobel Prizes for chemistry in the early years of the 20th century and see who was winning them all. It's one German name after another, after another, after another. So Pervitin was on the shelf. It was not even a prescription drug. It was marketed, there would be ads, marketing toward housewives. Do your housework in half the time. And that's for sure. You scrambled eggs with one hand and burping the baby with the other. It's also some of the opioids for teething, difficulty teething. Heroin, invented by Bayer Pharmaceuticals, was marketed for teething babies. I mean, again, this is some world that none of us can understand anymore, but it is true. These were wonder drugs that would make life better and make life easier and get rid of all your aches and pains. And so there is no doubt that the Germans, were wired in the course of World War II. That may have played some role in the almost complete absence of moral considerations which the Wehrmacht often employed towards civilian populations and Jews in the area of occupation. It might have played a role. I'm uncomfortable saying that, well, the drugs made me do it. Normally I'm really a nice guy until I take the meth. I don't think that's a valid historical argument, but it is one that you do see people entering. So we have a museum. I've mentioned it a couple times. I'll probably mention a couple more, the National World War II Museum. And we had Norman Ohler speak at our international conference, which takes place every November. And he was fantastic, and he went through this whole thing, and he said, he said, I was a disc jockey in Berlin, and when I started writing on this topic, because I was quite interested in pharmaceuticals. This is in front of our audience, and I want to say, Norman, stop. I'm a disc jockey, and I really was interested in pharmaceuticals. He said, a friend of mine found some Pervitin from World War II, and we tried it. And I was saying, Norman, stop. We're just watching our careers go up in smoke as Norman talks about recreational drug use in Berlin. Germans have a very different view of these sorts of things today. But it's a good book. It's been criticized for the reasons I just said. Is it giving Hitler a pass? Hitler was taking opioids to bring him down and Pervitin to bring him up. I mean, he was on a lot of different medications. Is it giving Hitler a pass? Ohler never says that in the book. So I think people hear the topic and then they kind of fill in what they think the book is about. And I think they're often criticizing a book they haven't read. Which, reviewers have been known to criticize books they haven't read. You're very busy, and you got to bang out a review, and you read the publicity sheet on it, maybe, and then take it from there. But anyway, good question. And Norman Ohler's book is called Blitzt in English. In German, it's Der große Rausch, the big rush, which is an even better title, perhaps, than Blitz. Sir.
Thank you. You are fascinating.
Oh, well, thank you. Appreciate that.
I would like to ask a huge question,
Yep.
which is, what are the biggest principles that you have discovered about war in your studies? Principles that might tie into America, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Big principles that are reaffirmed by the German experience. That's question one.
Oh, no.
Well, I'm just
Wow.
saying, that's a huge question.
You guys bring it in Missoula, man.
Okay,
That's a big
but the
question.
second question is more fun. How in the hell do men fight a losing war when they know it's a losing war? We got Vietnam, maybe we have Iraq, maybe we have Afghanistan. So I'm suggesting there is a huge potential parallel between the Wehrmacht, in 1944, and knowing they're lost and yet still fighting.
Yeah.
Please, thank you.
Well, let me do the big question. The second question, which you claimed is fun, isn't actually fun at all. it's a big question too. So let me go through both of those. So what have I learned? What principles have I learned about war in the course of my studies? I worship at the altar of St. Carl. His last name is Clausewitz. He is, to my mind, the greatest greatest philosopher. He's a German, the greatest philosopher of war of all time. He was a Prussian. There was no unified Germany when Clausewitz was alive. He fought in the Napoleonic Wars. He fought on Napoleon's side, and he fought for Prussia, and he fought for Napoleon. He got to see, life from both sides of the hill, as it were. He came back from that experience. He had been a young officer in the Prussian army, reputation as the greatest military force in the world. Napoleon flicked it away in a single afternoon at Jena and Auerstedt in 1806. Kind of crushed his own spirit, his own morale. He began thinking very deeply of the experience he'd had in his whole life, and he wrote a book with the real anodyne, plain old title of On War. On War. It's a doorstop, it's a big book. It's not 50 pages, which will give you like a little list of aphorisms you can memorize. It's a very, very profound analysis of war as a phenomenon. Not individual wars and necessarily how you react in certain battles, but war as a phenomenon. And so when I think of the lessons that I've learned from my study of war, I come back to Clausewitz a lot, who said a few things about war. He said that war is essentially an act of violence to compel our enemy to do our will. So first, if you want to talk about war, you have to confront the human propensity towards violence. But is war just violence? Because if it is, I've been in some bar brawls. They were violent, let me tell you. When I was once in a bar, I had nothing to do with this, when a firearm was discharged. I remember thinking, I got to get out of here. That's how I wanted to react to that. So is that war? Is it just a bar brawl? No, Clausewitz said. War, at its root, is also about politics. And in fact, it's the continuation of politics by other means. So two countries have a trade dispute, and then they ratchet up the rhetoric. Then there's a border incident, and then remember the Maine, there's a headline, and then from the next thing you know, you're at war. And so without politics, war is just a bar brawl. We should avoid it for all possibilities. It's death and destruction for no reason. But politics at least gives it some purpose. And if you don't have a political goal in war, or a sound one, or a good one, or a well thought out one, probably shouldn't go to war. But there's something else. So war is about passion and violence, and then war is about rationality and politics. They're two poles, right? But he added a third. He said war is also about chance. Once the armies clinch, once the fleets clash at sea, who knows what's going to happen? Little things can happen that turn into big things. It can rain. And a dispatch that had to get from the regiment, or from the division to the regiment, doesn't arrive. And the regiment starts out on the road an hour later than it should. And so it crashes in at a crossroads into another regiment, which is supposedly having right away at the time. Your whole battle plan just falls apart. Clausewitz said it was friction. So you have a plan, it's beautiful on paper. All plans are beautiful on paper. When you actually try to do it, a little more difficult. Sand gets into the gears and it wears down. So Clausewitz said, long story short, Clausewitz said that war is an amazing trinity, an amazing three-sided object, which is passion and the human propensity toward violence. That might be, if you want, that could be like the passion of the masses. They're angry. The people are angry about something. And then it's about the rationality of politics, and hopefully that's wise leaders at the top, who are not trying to conquer the world, for example. But even if you've thought it through completely, you go to war, you're going to get surprised every single time. And that's war, he said, as a three-sided object, or amazing trinity. So that's what I've learned about war. I've learned that if you can plan it out all you want. You can do every single planning exercise, every single staff ride, every single war game. Everything's lined up. But once you actually try to do it, you're almost never going to get what you thought you were going to get. Certainly happened in World War II over and over and over again to all the combatants. Now, the second question, I think, is I'm going to give you a short version, and then I have something else to say. How do you keep fighting a lost war? I think that probably has to be debated for each war. I think there are different reasons. I think in the German case, this was a corporate body, an officer corps going back hundreds of years centuries into the Prussian past, but also looking back to 1918. To a man in World War II, the Germans believed, that the same guys that fought World War I, they believed they had lost World War I because they gave in too quickly. They had been stabbed in the back by the home front. And now the home front was standing strong behind Hitler. One thing you have to say, there was never a mutiny of the home front against Hitler in World War II. The home front was standing strong. None of those German officers were going to be the first to say, well, the war's lost. By the way, I would draw some distinction between Iraq or Vietnam. The American military was not being beaten in the sense that the Germans were being beaten in 44, 45. They were often coming very, very, very short of their objectives. But I'm talking about big thumpings. I'm talking about 152, 3, 4, 500,000 German prisoners in these battles with the Soviet army in 1944, 45, battles with the Western Allies. But I will also say this. My topic tomorrow for the seminar, are we calling it? Mike, is that what it's called? My topic tomorrow for the seminar is what kept the Germans fighting in 1944, 45. So I'm requesting your presence. Is that good? I will have the point is, have a lot more to say about that tomorrow.
In the last few frames of the series Vietnam, Stanley Carno's work, I think it was about a 12-part television series, the producers, I believe, sent a message to the viewer. The final scenes showed the Da Nang supply base, which was a huge complex in Vietnam. And within the fenced area, there was everything from fighter aircraft to refrigerators to fans. And I can't help but remember that fan blade turning slowly in the wind.
Right.
And I think the message was that the people who supply the military are heavily invested in war. And the same type of scene was presented at the end of the Civil War series by, help me with his name.
Ken Burns? Ken Burns? Yeah.
It showed the Northern armaments companies with all of their cannons lined up. And they could have fought that war with one hand tied behind them.
Right.
In one of the final rooms at Dachau, on the tour where they allow you to go, there's a plaque. It's about 3 or 4 feet wide and maybe 5 feet high, maybe about that size. And it lists all of the German companies that were lobbying Adolf Hitler. Messerschmitt is really right up there at the top of the list.
Right.
So I would ask you to comment, if you would, on the position, the status, the motives of the United States, which is arguably the largest supplier of arms in the world.
You know, I was born in 1958, so I came of age, you might say, as a young, but kind of precocious boy in the 1960s counterculture, and then came of age in the 70s, graduated from high school in 75. So I lived, during the rise of Bob Dylan, and the song Masters of War makes that very point, that there are people who profit off of war. We live in a capitalist economy, and as far back as World War II, but certainly earlier than that, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, said to President Roosevelt, if we're going to win this war, we have to do it through business. And if you're going to have business, get business on board, you've got to make this profitable. And so in World War II, we always talk about the arsenal of democracy, right? American businesses and the whole nation came together as one, right, and fought the war. It's a little overdone. Any historian can tell you that there were all kinds of divisions within the American home front. Certainly Japanese Americans, had a very difficult situation than others, so I don't have to belabor that point, of course. But business was on board because there was a guaranteed 8% profit with every government contract. It was cost plus contracting. So, you deliver on time and you deliver the goods as promised, and you were guaranteed an 8% profit. That's essentially, I live in New Orleans, big gambling city. There's a Harrah's casino in line of sight of my apartment. That's essentially what Harrah's makes. It's 8% vig, 8% profit every night on gambling. So there's no doubt that profits are made off of war. I would also say that until we figure out another way to do it, if the political leaders of the United States or any modern country wish to go to war, they're going to have to find a way to get business on board to do it. And the way to get business on board to do that, to produce what you want produced in the time you want it produced, is usually to make it profitable. It's funny that after World War I, there's a great deal of backlash in America at home about those who would profit, the war profiteers of World War I. But World War II, by and large, that was not part of the American scene. You could probably make a better case. The profits were much larger for business in World War II. But most Americans, I think, felt that the political end was worth fighting for. So, I mean, yeah, a lot of people are invested in war. Business is invested in war. Certainly the military, we've already had a question of, why don't these guys just stop? Well, because they're professionals is one answer. They've been trained to do something. They're going to do it until the politicians tell them to stop. But we also have to look at civilian politicians are invested in war. If you walk into the president's office and say, look, we should bomb Libya, or whatever you're saying, it better work. Or your own career has just been torpedoed. So there are a lot of people invested in war. Of course, who would not be surprised by this at all? Clausewitz. Clausewitz would say there's a human propensity for violence. And we build societies that can effectively wield mass violence, either in self-defense or sometimes in aggression against our adversaries. We hope it's usually self-defense. It's a profound question. I almost feel like quoting, I think President Obama's greatest quote of all time was, he was asked some very complex question. He said, "That's above my pay grade." And I think that the question of the human propensity toward violence is probably, which I think is at the root of the question you asked, I think probably requires an ethicist and a philosopher as much as it requires a historian.
What about the fomentation of the war, fostering the war, the creation of the war situation?
Well, sure. Arms manufacturers love to sell weapons. Newspapers love to sell papers. Television stations love ratings. Nowadays, it's click-throughs. You have a website, and it's how many people have clicked through your website. So if you run a website, you love click-throughs. So there's all kinds of ways to do that, and one of those is to stir up people's passions. I look at the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta in the 4th century BCE. It was certainly fomented by a small clique of politicians in both those cities. I don't think there's any doubt about it. We're able to kind of play on popular passions. So, sir.
Yes, could you speak briefly about the air war on the Eastern Front and the Soviet Air Force, and was air power significant in that theater?
Yes, I can. The Red Air Force, the Soviet Air Force, the Red Air Force that was still known in June of 1941 when the Germans launched the surprise attack on the Soviet Union, was essentially destroyed on the ground. Thousands of aircraft destroyed on the ground. This is tactical surprise of a sort. A strategic surprise, but also local tactical surprise. Aircraft were lined up. There was no anti-aircraft. The batteries were not being manned. And so the Germans in the first week of the campaign essentially destroyed the Red Air Force. And that, of course, is how they managed to drive so far so fast. 250, 270, 300 miles the first week of the fighting. We often hear the Germans, they would stop just short of Moscow. They were 2/3 of the way to Moscow in a month. By the end of the Battle of Smolensk, essentially, they had gone far and fast, and largely because they had air power and the Soviets didn't. Soviets managed, as you probably know, to dismantle many of their wartime industries, aircraft production being foremost amongst them, tank production second, and shipping them east of the Ural Mountains, a long way, and then getting that back online. That wasn't until 1942. But here's the big problem. The Germans essentially had a tactical air force. They didn't have strategic bombers. They were trained to operate in cooperation with land forces, with ground forces. The size of the Soviet front, which is thousands of miles from north to south, from the Arctic Ocean to the Caspian Sea, let's say, the size of that front made it impossible ever to assemble in one place as much air power as the Western Allies were routinely able to do in the West. And so air power plays a role, but I don't think it in the fighting on the Eastern Front. I don't think it plays quite the decisive role that it played in the West for that very reason. There were battles taking place regularly between the Red Army and the Wehrmacht, the German army in the East, in which air power played a relatively minor role. And you can read that again in I say, if you read the memoirs of the typical German grunt, which, it's not healthy for your psyche, but I've sort of spent a lifetime doing it. You read the same thing over and over again. That was an air raid. But it's never the description of the air raids that they experienced if the same man had fought on the Western Front. So they do play a role, and I would say the same sort of thing. The Germans are still, I don't want to go all the way back, but that dive bomber, the Stuka, The Germans are still trotting that out there in 1943. They've equipped it with a cannon now, and it's a very effective tank-busting weapon. But it too was a wasting resource, and the Germans were never able to produce enough of them. German memoirs, Hans Rudel, the great Stuka commander, almost certainly exaggerate the number of tanks they were destroying. Hundreds, and they're German aces with 300 and 400 and 500 kills, and it's been very difficult to go, claimed kills. It's been very difficult to go back and verify any of this, some of the more extreme numbers. So air power plays a role. Air power is not a luxury. Air power is essential in modern military operations. If you don't have it, you're toast. And the Soviets didn't have it early, and they were toast. They managed to get equilibrium in 1942 and 1943, superiority and supremacy by 44 and 45. I'd say in some ways it's similar, but it's a very different front. I would emphasize that. Oh, have to hand that over?
Yeah. It's been a long day. Professor Citino's been traveling. Is the mic working? Okay. And I think it's time to bring this to a halt and to thank Professor Citino for his talk and go home. Thanks very much.
I'll come back anytime.